We are used to thinking about the free market as the most efficient economic system.
Well, yes, that is the case. The free market is the most efficient system.
We're told so all the time by all kinds of people.
And what kinds of people are those?
But is it really true?
Oh, it's absolutely true. The capitalist system rewards success and it punishes failure.
Is it really all that efficient?
Yes, it is efficient if you understand what a free market is. That a free market's got nothing to do with all of this government's intervention.
After looking at the evidence, I don't think so anymore.
When you look at history, the most inefficient economies have all been those that moved away from capitalism.
And maybe by the end of this video you'll come to the same conclusion.
Well, after they watch my video, I think they'll think twice about that argument that you've made.
Let's start with the reason neoliberals, that's people who support the free market no matter what.
So this term neoliberal is basically a lie. It's this idea that somehow we've been transiting towards this of a free market economy.
Think that it's the most efficient economic system in chapter 1. The market in theory.
It isn't a case that we think it's the most efficient. We've got the evidence that it is the most efficient.
The purpose of the free market is to distribute resources.
Actually, the purpose of the free market is to give people the liberty to choose, to work for themselves or for others, to have the freedom to exchange, do business. It's all to do with giving people opportunity in life.
The market doesn't produce anything on its own, just transport stuff from one person who has it to one person who needs it.
It's unbelievable. In fact, the private sector is the productive sector. There are plenty of innovators in the free market. They have the competition, they've got the incentive to do so, they've got the freedom to do so, the freedom to think for themselves. If I have something that is of benefit to you, and you have something that's of benefit to me, and if both parties agree upon that exchange, then the voluntary exchange takes place.
It does this with financial incentive. If resources are scarce in a region, then their price will rise and there will be an incentive to produce the resources or transport them to the people who need them.
The thing that I find remarkable is the fact that you acknowledge the fact that the higher price is a signal to tell you there's a shortage, that there's a scarcity of that resource. Now, you've looked at it in black and white and said, well, this will just give the incentive for the producer to produce more. Well, how can he? Because you've said the resource itself is scarce. So it's not a case that they can just produce more of it. But what the higher price does, say for example, let's just say oak goes into scarcity in a country. It means that all of the wooden products made by oak, the price of those goods will rise. What that does is it disincentivizes the consumers from overspending on that resource until they can replenish that resource. That way you're not overusing it. That's the purpose of the higher price. That's called efficiency.
In the end, the person making and distributing the products makes a profit and the people who need the products get them.
As if to say that profits is just all evil and it's all greed, and it's just a case that there's no such thing as charity anyway in the first place. The famine in Ireland, a very tragic thing, but what Turkey was offering was 10,000 dollars worth in charity.
We have two towns. We named them Berlin and London. London has a lot of food and Berlin was just hit by a drought and it doesn't have any food. Because of the scarcity, the little food that's left in Berlin will become really expensive. So expensive, in fact, that the rich people in London get an idea. They will buy a lot of food in London and sell it in Berlin for profit. If possible, they will even increase the food production to provide exactly as much food as everyone needs. Sounds great, doesn't it? And so natural as well.
Now, charity isn't something done out of the sake of profit. So what she's done, she's just completely negated the fact that charity exists. Even if we go along with her argument and say that, certain capitalists get the idea to then buy up food and then sell off. She mentions about how the fact that they would increase the productivity. Well, what happens when you increase the productivity? The price falls. So it'd actually be cheaper for them.
No boss, no management, just people acting in the best way possible. And it would be great if it worked like that in praxis. But I'm afraid it doesn't. And I'm afraid there are many cases in which the free market wastes a lot of resources.
Capitalism's about rewarding success and punishing failure. In other words, rewarding efficiency and punishing inefficiency. No one would say that the 19th century in the United States was exactly this pure free market. Not the case, because there was creeping corporatism between about the 1860s right up for a good 50 odd years. In this time period, there was a great example with John Davison Rockefeller, and I've said before, the reason he became so successful was how intelligent the man was. It was purely down to the fact that he was far more efficient than that of his competitors. The very businesses in the 1860s who were going under were all the other competitors, because Rockefeller entered the oil refinery market in 1863. Hundreds of others would enter the market. Now, it's all to do with the laws of supply and demand. The greater the supply of providers, in other words, other businesses, then the price of the barrel of oil would drop, wouldn't it? Because there's going to be an increase of productivity, there's more businesses doing it, and as a result, the price of a barrel of oil would drop. So much so that by 2 years later, by 1865, the price of a barrel of oil dropped by 50%. This resulted in massive losses on these other oil refinery companies. They relied upon the higher price of the barrel of oil. The price drop because of the increase of productivity, because there's more and more, companies entering the market. They were getting less value out of it, so they were making losses. Why was it that Rockefeller was doing so well for himself, but these other companies weren't? It's because of their inefficiency. A prime example of that, they were taking about 40 odd to about 60 odd % of their crude oil and they were just dumping it. The one who was most rewarded, the one who was gaining the profits, was Rockefeller, because he was utterly obsessed with efficiency. He was an accountant by trade. That's why Rockefeller was so far ahead of his competition. That was the market punishing inefficiency and rewarding efficiency. You're living under a system of corporatism, a system that rewards failure and punishes success. She didn't tell you that.
Let's look at how it really works in Part 2, the market in praxis. The free market has been in place for roughly 200 years in most European countries by now.
And that is just absolute nonsense, folk. So many of these countries have faced fascism. Take France, for example, the French Revolution, Nazi Germany. She honestly tried to say that that was some sort of a free market. Or take, for example, the Weimar Republic. Bloody socialist regime. Is that somehow free market? What on earth is she even going on about? And even Great Britain, the British Industrial Revolution was rife, dominated by mercantilism, which is basically anti-capitalism.
Even longer in the USA.
The 1800s, in other words the 19th century of the United States of America, was not this strong free market. Yes, there was periods where the market was left be free, and you could look at periods in certain parts of the market and say, okay, here's something to show free markets work. For example, the private turnpike industry in the first industrial revolution was in the absence of these government subsidies, in other words, the internal improvements. There was no income tax, and you could see how the free market goes. But again, you go into the 1860s, and then you would see the socialist government subsidies with the internal improvements. That's what I'm saying.
Right now, the market is global, and the entire world, ignoring North Korea, trades with each other.
But the market is not the free market.
You can buy anything in any country and sell it in any other country to anyone who will buy it. It's a global system.
But again, that so-called global system is filled with all these countries that are all mixed economies, rife with corporatism.
So let's look at our example again. We have Berlin and we have London, and Berlin is starving. Does London still deliver the aid to Berlin in real life? The answer is yes. Under one condition. Only if the people of Berlin are rich enough to justify the transport costs.
What the free market does, what charity does, charity works more efficiently, comes from the people and goes directly to the people. In this example, using Berlin would not need to foot the cost because that's covered in the aid that's provided by the country that's charitable.
Remember, the investors from London only help Berlin if they can make a profit of it.
This is just laughable. I mean, what do you expect people to do? Do you expect people to just work for free? No, they actually need to make a living. You ignore what profits are. Profits is the information of consumers' needs and wants. And the example to do with profits and losses is that you think food is just all one, ignoring the fact that consumers all have different needs and wants. We don't all like the same type of food, and not all food is the same. That's like saying everybody likes seafood. You need to know from all the different types of food where you're going to allocate the different types of food in the different parts of the market.
This may not seem too complicated, but it leads to a lot of problems and frankly ridiculous situations in real life. Globally, Earth produces enough food for roughly 10 billion people. There are only 7.5 billion people on Earth.
You don't even bother to acknowledge the fact that certain people are lactose intolerant, other people have nut allergies. I know people who just don't like cheese, and I wouldn't even understand them. Who am I to judge them? You don't even bother to question the fact that even take for example milk, not all milk is the same. You've got all the variety of different options. You've got all the different types of cheese, and all the different types of butter, etc, etc, etc. And the other thing that you ignore, and this was in relation to do with the Labour theory of value, Ludwig von Mises asked the question, who is it valuable to? So take for example chicken, who's it going to be valuable to? Well, it's not going to be valuable to that of vegans, is it? At what time is it valuable in relation to what other given products? What are you going to do when you've got all the options to take into account and how much you're going to have to, produce of it? You don't live under a free market. That's the reason for the waste.
This fact, combined with the hyper-efficient free market, should mean that every single person on Earth is overweight.
Again, the problem with that argument is you don't live under this hyper, super efficient free market. You're living under corporatism because of socialism.
You already know that that's not true. There are millions of people starving each year, and according to the United Nations, 800 million people lack the food to live a healthy life.
You ignore this quote. Food shipments in case of dire local shortage are generally uncontroversial, but as Amartya Sen has shown, most famines involve a local lack of income rather than of food. In such situations, food aid, as opposed to financial aid, has the effect of destroying local agriculture and serves mainly to benefit Western agribusiness, which are vastly overproducing food as a result of agricultural subsidies. What the hell has subsidies got to do with a free market? A free market, an exchange, can only take place if both parties agree upon the exchange.
Remember, this isn't the problem with the amount that's produced. This is a problem of distribution. And the global network of distribution is the free market.
How on earth did you draw to the logical conclusion that you're living under some sort of free market? What the hell has agricultural subsidies got to do with a free market?
So how does it fail? It seemed like such a great system in theory, and the problem wasn't something many people considered, to be honest.
It failed because of your socialism. Government subsidies are inefficient. You could contrast the difference between that of the political entrepreneurs in the 19th century to that of the market entrepreneurs. Take, for example, the North Pacific Railroad Company that was guaranteed over $1,000 subsidy for every 1 mile of track that they would build. They ended up rushing into building it. The railroad around the Rockies, the long route, by the time they finished it, of course it would face, poor weather conditions. It caused damage. It was going to cost them about $500,000, I think it was, to try and repair, the damages. But of course, Congress rejected that. They weren't getting any more subsidies. And of course, in 1873, the company faced bankruptcy. They weren't the only one. Hundreds of others who took on the government subsidies all faced bankruptcy. And it didn't just happen in the railroad industry. It happened in the steamship industry. Hundreds of companies all going bankrupt because of the government subsidies. But there it was, the likes of Vanderbilt in the steamship industry, with his 4 steamships that were modest. They weren't exactly the best quality, but he was running his business efficiently. He refused to take on government subsidies, and he was running into a profit. And of course, the customers could, trust them. With the North Pacific Railroad Company, when it rushed into building it, they weren't interested in their neighbours, shall I say. They ignored them. They used poor quality materials, they rushed into building it, it cost them more, and along comes a free marketeer, a market entrepreneur, not a political entrepreneur. And I know that you love to, conflate political entrepreneurs and market entrepreneurs as if they're the same thing. The market entrepreneur, James J. Hill, not only would he build his railroad much quicker, with much better quality materials at a far cheaper cost, he was benefiting the neighbouring people around him. He said to the neighbouring agricultural farmers, he says, if you build your farms around my railroad, I will reward you with grain in return. That's what the free market's all about. If you do something, I will give you something in return. That was the difference between the market entrepreneur who was efficient and that of the companies who took on the government subsidies. Why was there a difference? The North Pacific Railroad Company was guaranteed cash in hand. You try to paint things as if to say that the free market is at fault.
Overproduction. The free market doesn't produce as much as it needs, it produces way more.
How do you maximize your profits? You maximize your profits by minimizing your costs. It costs you more to use more resources. So why would they overproduce? For those in a free market who would do so, such as for example oil refinery companies, they were all going bankrupt. You ignore that fact. What incentive is there for you to produce or overproduce something if it's going to make you a loss? If you have to overproduce something and much of it goes to waste, that comes at a cost. It makes you as a business losses. And what the free market does to businesses like that punishes them. And along comes a competitor that is more efficient than them and wipes the floor with them. Sounds a bit like John Davison Rockefeller.
The reason is simple. If you produce groceries and sell them to a supermarket, then you have to compete with different producers as well.
That's a bit like saying that John Davison Rockefeller was faced with all of those competitors, so he needs to overproduce and create such waste. Really? If anything, what Rockefeller did was the exact opposite, and he was the one reaping the most profits.
Let's say your apples are displayed just as much as your rivals' apples. And what do you do if you can't sell all of them? Do you produce less? Of course not. You invest in advertisement and hope that people will buy your apples next time. This problem is made worse by a praxis done by supermarkets.
So you honestly mean to tell me if a business is making losses and is overproducing and people are not buying it, they're honestly going to waste their time, resources and their money investing in that of, advertising to try and sell it off. Why would they do that? It's going to come at a greater cost. It's not cheap to advertise, so that's going to come at a heavy cost. That's going to make them more losses. So if they're already making losses, why would you seek to make even greater losses? Any sensible business person knows that if you're making losses, you're going to reduce the cost as much as possible and try and sell off as much as possible. And if anything, the free market would do that.
And of course, there are ecological problems with this. Producing food and then throwing it away is terrible for the environment.
And that's the day we recycling. The market's finding ways even to grind plastics down and use them in roads. Now, isn't it funny that the most polluted countries with such waste in the rivers, Eastern countries that are strongly socialist?
And there is one more reason to be critical of the market. Even though it overproduces so much, there are still millions starving on the planet. Roughly 9 million people starve each year. This is because of what I mentioned before. There is no profit in feeding the poor.
If anything, it's more profitable for you as a business person to reach out to as many people as possible. The greater number of customers you have, the greater, profit you're going to make overall.
And of course, that's what we see in real life. There are millions of tons of food being thrown away in Europe and America, while people in Africa and Asia are starving.
If the world was that simple, then it would be just as straightforward as that. But you're left with the economic reality. Humanity is filled with all different types of people, and we all have different tastes.
To me, this isn't efficient. To me, an efficient system would at least be able to distribute food to everyone who needs it. If someone says that the free market is efficient, they should have to be able to explain how.
The reason the free market's able to efficiently allocate resources in the hundreds of different options is through consumers' demand and through price signals. That's how we know. You see the price of ice cream drive up because consumers' demand drove up for it. Therefore, you know where milk is best allocated. You're not going to allocate it to the likes of the butter or the cheese that's in lesser demand, and you only know that information because the price drove up. So you remove prices, how do you know that information? Now you take that one small example and you place that across an entire city where there's hundreds of different options. You haven't got a clue. So anyway, folk, I think I've went on long enough with regards to that argument. So let's move on to some of the comments. As voluntarist Jeff mentions, Labour theory of value has been debunked successfully so many times by so many economists. As soon as it's mentioned, that individual has no credibility in my book. You're absolutely right, Jeff. When it came down to Karl Marx's view on value, the problem with the argument is the fact that value is really only going to be determined down to consumers' preference. And that is something that's so simple to understand. And Xazy was all over the shop. It's a bit like this of Viki's argument. SH goes on to say between 720 to 739, this here is the perfect confirmation that socialists hate to leave people alone to choose for themselves. It's virtually none of his business to interfere with the pieces of what people wish to purchase. So you're absolutely right in what you say, because people's preference is really all down to what they want, and the fact that with socialists you just want to dictate your life. There's obviously time preference as well that they completely ignore. For example, at a time in someone's life they might have a time preference for certain other produce over other things. LilyDog12 says, please make a reading list video, Scotty. Also, it would be great if under each video you listed some relevant reading. I love your videos, but sometimes I find it difficult to follow your arguments, so to be able to have some reading sources would be so useful. Keep up the great work, mate. Well, LilyDog, I greatly appreciate that. I will, of course, get around to doing perhaps a video on recommendations, provide sources and stuff like that for certain topic issues. Honda Kwan goes on to say, hey Scotty, again, brilliant video. This response will be much shorter than the last one, as I see less to add on to. The main thing that came to mind was when you were talking about computers and how the socialists used them as a defence because they could not get around the economic calculation on their own. A nice fact you should know is that market socialism was more or less made for the same reason. A Polish social democrat, I forget his name, if I remember correctly, created market socialism in response to Mises' argument about calculation. Mises then responded by talking about how either prices reflect markets or, if they are state controlled, play prices. Yeah, I've mentioned before, I will of course go into the whole thing on the market socialism. Really all market socialism is just a desperate attempt to relabel socialism. The market is capitalist. It's a rejection of socialism. Big part of what defines socialism is central planning. They don't like that. The reason they don't like that is because the fact that it's never worked. It's faced with the economic calculation problem, and that being the prime example. Entertainment Garrett goes on to say, decentralization is a horrible idea. Cornell University and the World Bank did a study and found that decentralization decreases efficiency while increasing corruption. So he is being dishonest when he asserts decentralization make things more efficient. Well, the correction that I kind of made, and I obviously saw your point in the later comment that you responded in relation to that, and then I kind of seen where you're coming from. The reality is with socialism, there's no such thing as this decentralization. The only thing that I can think of in their argument is individual communes. Socialism in practice can't have that. The reason being is because if you were to have individual communes, right, and you've got a country the size of Great Britain, and then you've got about 65 million people, and you've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different products out there on the market. They couldn't have that, because then first of all, they would lead to what you call inequality, and that's against the entire basis of socialism. Socialism is all about trying to create this overall equality. It's why there was the central planning. It's why there was the attempt to plan for the economy, to create an egalitarian utopia. When you've got such a large-scale economy, they've got no choice but to have thing that you saw in the Soviet Union, such as the 5-year plan. So anyway, folk, thank you for watching the video. Hope you've found it educational. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up, share the video, and of course, I shall talk to you later. Cheers.